The letter that ended Edie Marlow's career arrived in a plain brown envelope with the university crest in the corner, and she read it standing up in the corridor outside the lab she was no longer permitted to enter. And the thing she remembered afterward was not the words but the sound, the particular small sound the lock made when the technician changed the code behind her. A soft electronic chirp, almost cheerful, the sound of a door deciding she was on the wrong side of it. She had been right. That was the part nobody wanted to hear, then or for a long time after. 3 years before, Dr. Edith Marlow, maritime archaeologist, had stood up in front of a heritage assessment panel and said that the timbers recovered off the Pendrith bar were not what the celebrated Professor Aldous Crane said they were, that his dating was wrong, his provenance was wrong, and that the artifacts he had built a triumphant public narrative around had been, to put it plainly, salted, mixed with material that did not belong, to make a thin find look like the discovery of a career. She had the dendrochronology. She had the sediment analysis. She had, she thought, the truth, and she had been naive enough to believe in those rooms that the truth was the strongest thing a person could bring to a table. Aldous Crane brought something stronger. He brought 40 years of reputation, a knighthood in the offing, 3 colleagues who owed him their posts, and a quiet word in the right ears that the young Dr. Marlow was unstable, difficult, ambitious past her competence, the sort who tears down what she cannot build. By the time it was finished, it was not Crane's dating that was in question. It was Eddie's judgment. The university did not quite sack her. That would have required a finding, a process, a chance for her to produce her evidence in the open. They did the modern thing instead. They restructured. Her post was no longer aligned with strategic priorities. Her funding evaporated. Her name came off 2 papers she had done the real work on. And the brown envelope, when it came, was almost a formality, the lock already changed, the decision already a fact wearing the costume of a letter. So at 38, Edie Marlow, who had once mapped wreck sites in 4 seas and could read 3 centuries of a ship's life in the wear pattern of a single recovered cleat, was cleaning display cases. That was the work she could get. A private maritime museum on the south coast, a small one, gift shop and cafe, and a dozen glass cases of rope and brass. And Eddie came in before opening to polish the glass and check the humidity logs and write the little cards. And the owner thought she was overqualified for it, and never once asked why a woman who clearly knew this much was willing to do this little. People don't ask. That was a thing Eddie had learned the hard way and would later use like a blade. That the world looks at a woman doing small work and simply files her under small, and stops looking, and that being stopped looking at is the closest thing to invisibility a person can have while still standing in the light. She had got good at the invisibility. That was the strange thing she noticed about those 2 years, the years she did not talk about, that the disappearing had a craft to it, and she had learned the craft, and some cold, practical part of her had even come to value it. She wrote the little cards for the cases, and she wrote them better than they had ever been written, precise and alive, and visitors lingered longer at the cases now, and the owner took the credit and never wondered, and Eddie let him, and filed the not wondering away as data. She watched school groups come through, and a teacher once stood at the case of navigational instruments, and explained an astrolabe entirely wrongly to 30 children 3 feet from a woman who had handled a dozen of them off the seabed. And Eddie said nothing, and wiped the glass, and understood with a clarity that did not hurt as much as it should have that her knowledge was not gone, was not even diminished, was simply unseen, that she was a fully loaded thing that the world had decided was empty, and that the gap between what she was and what she was taken for had become, without her quite deciding it, the most interesting fact about her life. She did not yet know what she would do with that gap. She only knew, the way you know weather, that a person carrying that much unspent capacity does not stay quietly polishing glass forever. Something, eventually, finds her. She did not imagine it would be a dead woman and a hole in a floor. She was polishing a case of signal lanterns when the call came about the shack. a solicitor in Pendrith, the very place, which she noted with the flat private irony of someone who has stopped expecting the world to be tactful, informing her that her great-aunt Winifred Tregorick had died, and had left her, Edith Marlow, her entire estate, which consisted of one property, a fisherman's net shack on the shingle below the village, and the strip of foreshore it stood on, and its contents such as they were. Edie had met Winifred Tregorick exactly twice. Once as a child, a fierce salt-cured old woman who smelled of tar and pipe smoke, and had looked at 8-year-old Edie with an attention no other adult had ever turned on her, as though taking a measurement. And once at 26, briefly, at a family funeral, where Winifred had taken her by the wrist with a grip like a mooring line and said something Edie had not understood and had half forgotten. "You're the one who looks underneath." Good. The rest of them only ever looked at the surface and called it the sea. Then she had let go and gone back to the edge of the room, and Edie had not seen her again. And now the old woman was dead and had left the surface lookers nothing and left Edie a rotten shack on a beach. The family had opinions about that. Edie's cousin Hugh telephoned within a day of the will being read, magnanimous and oily, explaining that of course the shack was worthless, a liability really, sea damaged, probably condemned, and that he'd be willing to take it off her hands and deal with the demolition costs himself, save her the bother, family looking after family. Edie listened to the shape of his eagerness and said she'd think about it. She had spent 3 years being told what she possessed was worthless by people very keen to possess it. She had developed an ear. She drove down to Pendrith on a grey Tuesday with the last of her savings in the account and the museum's grudging permission to take a week, and she saw the shack for the first time as an adult in the flat silver light of a falling tide. It was, by any ordinary reckoning, exactly what Hugh had said. A long, low building of tarred timber and stone, hunched on the shingle where the cliff came down, its roof swayed, its single seaward window blinded with salt, the door swollen in its frame. The sea had been working at it for 200 years, and the sea always wins eventually. You could see the eventually coming. Inside it smelled of brine and old rope, and the particular cold of a place the sun does not reach, and there was a lifetime of a fisherwoman's clutter, nets and floats and a tarred locker and a narrow cot where Winifred had apparently slept more nights than she'd slept in the cottage in the village, and Edie stood in the dim of it and felt, against all sense, something she had not felt in 3 years. She felt interested. Because Edie Marlow looked underneath. It was the whole of what she was, the thing Crane had tried to make into a flaw and Winifred had named like a blessing, and the floor of the shack was wrong. It took her the better part of the first day to understand why it was wrong, and she understood it the way she understood everything, not in a flash but in an accumulation, a slow gathering of small wrongnesses into a shape. The shack was built on shingle, and a shingle floor moves, shifts. You cannot keep it level, but a third of this floor, the landward third under the cot, was not shingle. It was flag, old stone flags, laid flat and true, and flags meant foundation. And there was no reason on earth for a net shack to have a stone-flagged floor over a deliberate foundation, unless there was something under it worth founding upon. The flags were worn in a pattern, too, worn most heavily not at the door, where feet would wear them, but in a curving line that led to the corner where the cot stood, as though for 200 years feet had gone again and again to that corner and stood there and done something. Edie moved the cot. She was a small woman and the cot was iron and it took her a while, and her hands were cold and the light was going, and when she had it clear she knelt on the worn flags in the corner and she found, with fingers that had spent 20 years reading the meaning of seams and joints, and the places where one made thing meets another, the edge. A line in the stone too straight to be a crack. A square, perhaps a yard on a side, set into the flagged floor, fitted so finely that 2 centuries of grit had nearly sealed it but not quite, and at one edge, worn smooth and dark by the touch of a great many hands across a great many years, a shaped depression where a finger could hook. A trapdoor. She crouched there in the dark and the cold with her heart going hard, and she did not even then let herself believe anything in particular, because believing too soon was the error she had watched destroy lesser archaeologists, and she had built her whole ruined career on refusing it. She told herself it was probably a fish cellar, a cold store, a smuggler's hide. This coast was full of them, romantic and empty. She told herself all the ordinary things. And then she hooked her cold finger into the worn depression and lifted, and the stone came up on a pivot more smoothly than 200 years had any right to allow, balanced, engineered, made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and a breath of air came up out of the dark beneath it, and it was the wrong air. Not the dank, exhausted air of a sea cave or a damp cellar. It was dry. Cool and still and bone-dry, the impossible dry of a sealed space the sea has never reached, and on it faint came a smell that stopped Edie Marlow's breath in her throat, because she knew it. She had smelled it in the deep holds of recovered wrecks and the sealed rooms of unrobbed sites. The smell of old tar and old oak and old time. The smell of something that has been waiting, undisturbed in the dark, for a very long time. She found a torch in Winifred's locker. Her hands were not quite steady. And she put her legs into the dark of the open trapdoor, and felt for and found the rungs of a ladder worn smooth as the flag above it. And she went down into whatever her grey-tan had left her, alone, with the tide turning far out across the bar and no one in the world knowing where she was. The chamber under the shack was the size of a small chapel, and it had been cut into the living rock of the cliff's foot, and it was dry because someone 2.5 centuries ago had understood drainage and air the way only people who keep things hidden for a living ever understand them. Eddie's torch found stone walls, a vaulted roof, a floor of the same true flags, and then it found the things, and she stood at the bottom of the ladder and did not move for a long time, because she was looking at something that did not exist. There were chests, not the storybook kind, not heaped gold. She would have trusted that less. The storybook is always a lie. These were the real thing, the unglamorous true thing. Sea chests and document boxes and oilcloth-wrapped bundles, ranged along the walls on stone shelves cut for the purpose, and ship's gear, and a long rack of recovered fittings, and crates packed with straw long gone to dust. It was not a treasure hoard. Eddie's trained eye understood what it was within 90 seconds, and the understanding made her sit down slowly on the worn bottom rung because her legs had stopped being reliable. It was an asterisk collection, a catalogued, ordered, deliberate collection, assembled over what must have been generations, of material recovered from wrecked ships. And on the wall above the largest shelf, painted directly onto the dry stone in a careful hand, was a list. Names and dates, ship after ship after ship. The Mary Vane, asterisk 1748. The Bristol Maid, asterisk 1751. The asterisk Cormorant, asterisk 1758. Dozens of them, a tally going back the better part of 300 years, each with a date, and beside many of the dates a second mark, a small careful cross, and Eddie looked at the column of small careful crosses and felt the cold of the chamber get into her in a different way, because she knew suddenly, and with certainty, what the crosses were. They were the ships that had been made asterisk to wreck. This is the thing the comfortable histories leave out. The thing Eddie knew because she had spent her life in the true grain of maritime history rather than its souvenir version. That on certain hard coasts, in certain hard centuries, wrecking was not a misfortune that happened to ships. It was an industry that happened to them. Not the romantic salvage of the ballad, the other thing, the real thing, the deliberate luring of vessels onto the rocks with false lights. A lantern walked along the cliff at the pace of a riding light to draw a tired captain into his death, so that the cargo could be taken, and the crew, who were witnesses, were very often allowed or helped to drown. It was murder for profit, dressed by 2 centuries of soft local legend into something almost folkloric, the cheeky smugglers, the plucky coast. Eddie had read the court records that survived. She knew the soft legend was a coffin lid laid over a mass grave. And she was standing in the working archive of it, the chamber where, for generations, A family of wreckers had stored the recovered cargo, and more damning than any cargo, the asterisk papers, the ship's documents, the logs and manifests and personal effects of murdered crews, kept hoarded by people who could not bear to destroy what they had killed for, or who kept them as a ledger, or as insurance, or for some reason that died with them, kept in any case, dry and ordered and complete, in a stone chamber under a fishing shack, for 250 years, until they came into the hands of the one person alive who could read precisely what they were. And Edie understood, kneeling in the dust at the foot of the ladder, 3 further things in quick and terrible succession. The first was that her great-aunt Winifred had known. Of course she had known. You're the one who looks underneath. The rest of them only looked at the surface and called it the sea. Winifred had not left Edie a worthless shack. Winifred had left her, with deliberate and devastating precision, the single most important undisturbed maritime archaeological site in the country, and the documentary proof of a multi-generational pattern of mass murder, and had chosen Edie specifically, out of the whole grasping family, because Edie was the only one who would understand it and the only one who could not be bought to bury it. The inheritance was not luck. It was a commission. An old woman, at the end of a long life spent as the unwilling keeper of her family's true history, had reached out and chosen her instrument. The second thing Edie understood was whose history it was, because the careful painted hand on the wall, the generations of keeping, the family that had run this stretch of coast and this trade for 3 centuries. She knew the name before she found it at last on the oldest document box, burned into the wood, the family cipher, a stylized cormorant, wings spread. The bird of this coast, the bird on the village sign at Pendrith. The bird, Edie knew, on the crest of the Trevanian family. The Trevanians, who had owned this coast since before there were records, who had laundered 3 centuries of wrecking money into land and respectability and a baronetcy, and who were, at this exact moment, the toast of the entire region for a reason that made the chamber under the shack into a live grenade. Because Sir Julian Trevanian, the current head of the family, smooth and silver and ferociously well-connected, had spent 4 years and a great deal of borrowed money assembling the largest heritage and leisure development the county had ever seen. The Cormorant Quay, a vast marina and museum and hotel complex rising even now along the Pendrith front, 80 million pounds of it, half of it public and lottery and heritage fund money, the rest from investors who had been sold a story. And the story that justified the public money, that adorned the brochures and the planning documents and the great bronze statue going up on the new quay, was the heroic maritime heritage of the Trevanian family, the bold sea captains, the brave salvagers who had risked all to save souls from the cruel rocks. Sir Julian Trevanian had built an 80 million pound monument to a lie, and Edie Marlow was kneeling in the dust beneath the proof that his family had not saved the souls on those rocks. They had drowned them on purpose for the cargo and kept the receipts. The third thing she understood was that this would try to kill her, not metaphorically. She had been destroyed once already, professionally, comprehensively, by a single aging professor protecting a single thin reputation. She was now holding the thing that could collapse an 80 million pound development, a baronetcy, a 3-century myth, and the fortune and standing of one of the most powerful families in the West Country. She had learned the hard way exactly what powerful people do to inconvenient women holding inconvenient truths. And this time the truth was a great deal larger, and the powerful man a great deal richer, and the stakes not a reputation but an empire. She climbed out of the chamber and lowered the trap door and moved the cot back over it, and she sat in the cold shack as the dark came down over the bar, and she did not telephone anyone. Not the press, not the family, not the heritage authorities, not a soul. Because Edie Marlow had been naive once, in a paneled room 3 years ago, and had brought the truth to a table believing the truth would be enough, and had watched it be not enough, had watched it be turned against her, had learned that a truth without armor is just a target. She was not going to do that again. This time she was going to be slow and patient and quiet and absolutely certain, and she was going to build around this truth a structure so complete, so documented, so independently verified and legally armored and impossible to suppress, that when she finally set it on the table, there would be nothing Sir Julian Trevanion or anyone else could do but watch it stand. She had one advantage she had not had before, the only one, and it was the same advantage Winifred had used to choose her, that everyone, absolutely everyone, looked at Edith Marlow and saw a small, failed woman cleaning glass cases, a nobody who had inherited a rotten shack. They were not looking at her, and she was going to use every single day of their not looking. She began the next morning. Quietly, without a word to anyone, she started to do the work, and the work was the thing she was better at than almost anyone alive. What Edie did over the following months, she did the way a tide does its work, without announcement and without rest. She did not remove a single object from the chamber. She knew, as an archaeologist, that the moment artifacts leave their context they lose half their power as evidence and all their protection as a site, and that a thing kept where it was found, properly recorded, is a fortress, while a thing carried off in a bag is just a story. Instead, she documented. She photographed every object, every shelf, every painted name on the wall, in sequence with scale and reference, the way she had been trained, building a record so methodical that no one could ever claim she had planted or altered a thing. She transcribed the painted ledger. And then she began, by lamplight, on the papers, the logs, the manifests, the personal effects of the drowned, and she read 3 centuries of murder in the dry, careful hand of the people who had profited from it. And she wept sometimes, alone in the chamber, over a child's shoe kept in an oilcloth bundle beside the manifest of the ship it had drowned with, and then she dried her face and went on recording. Because the dead in that chamber had been waiting 250 years for one person to take their evidence seriously, and she was not going to fail them the way the world had failed her. She was careful in the village, too. She let it be known she was clearing the shack to sell it, played the overwhelmed air, accepted the locals' pity and their stories. And the stories were gold, because the old people of Pendrith carried, in the worn grooves of legend, the very thing the chamber documented, the tales of the false lights, the Trevanion luck, the families who had always known and never said. An old woman named Loveday Pascoe, 91 and clear as glass, told Edie over tea that her own great-great-grandmother had been a girl who walked a lantern on the cliff for the Trevanions and had never had a quiet night's sleep again in 70 years. And Edie recorded that too, with permission, gently, another timber in the structure she was building. She found a marine historian at a northern university with no connection to Crane or the Trevanions and no love of either, and brought her in under a confidentiality agreement to independently verify the documents. She found a heritage lawyer who specialized in exactly the collision of archaeology, treasure law, and public accountability that the chamber represented, and retained her with the last of the museum money and a promise of the rest. Brick by brick, quiet by quiet, the armor went on the truth. And then, as she had always known it would, the not looking ended, because power can smell a threat to itself long before it can see it. It began with Hugh, her oily cousin, telephoning again, the offer for the shack suddenly and suspiciously larger, and then larger again when she demurred, until it was a sum no one offers for a condemned net shack. And Edie understood that Hugh had been spoken to, that somewhere a word had gone round that the Marlow woman should be got off that foreshore by money before anyone wondered why. When the money failed, the pressure changed color. A planning officer she had never met wrote to inform her that her shack was the subject of a dangerous structure notice and a compulsory purchase order, the foreshore, required, for the final phase of the Cormorant Quay, demolition scheduled, compensation fixed, a date by which she must vacate the machinery of the state, bent quietly to a powerful man's need, arriving to erase the chamber under the cover of progress before she could ever reveal it. And then, the night after the CPO arrived, someone broke into the shack. She was not in it, That was luck, the only luck she allowed the story, and she had hedged even that she had been sleeping at Loveday Pascoe's because she had felt the weather changing. She came down at dawn to find the door forced and the inside ransacked, the cot thrown aside, the trapdoor found and flung open, and her heart did not stop because she had been ready for this, because everything that mattered was already gone from the chamber in the only way that mattered. It existed, fully recorded and independently verified and lodged in 3 sealed copies with 3 separate parties, in the cloud and in a solicitor's safe, and in a heritage archive 200 miles away. They could empty the chamber now. They could not empty the record. Sir Julian Trevanion had sent men to destroy a site, not understanding that the site's true value had already been extracted into a form he could not reach, by a woman who had learned the precise anatomy of suppression by being its victim and had built, this time, something that could not be suppressed. But they had emptied the chamber. Or tried to, and here the story turned on the thing Edie had understood and Sir Julian had not, which was that the chamber was a scheduling-grade archaeological site the instant it was discovered, and that removing material from it was not theft of Edie's property but the criminal destruction of protected national heritage, a serious crime, and that the men who had done it on a powerful man's instruction had created, in the doing, the one thing the truth had still lacked. A living, prosecutable, present-day crime that dragged the whole 3-century history into the daylight of a current investigation. Edie did not call the press about the wreckers. She called the police about the burglary, and the Heritage Crime Unit about the destruction of a scheduled site, and her lawyer about the CPO, and she handed each of them one clean, narrow, devastating piece of the structure she had built. And then she let the structure do what a true structure does, which is stand while the people who attacked it fall against it. The public showdown was not a dramatic confrontation. Edie had no taste for those and no need of one. It was a heritage inquiry, convened when the destruction of a scheduled site on the footprint of a major lottery-funded development could no longer be kept quiet, held in the county hall with the press in the gallery and Sir Julian Trevanion in the front row in a beautiful suit, certain still, even then, that his name and his money and his connections would carry him as they always had. And Dr. Edith Marlow, whom he had taken for a small failed woman cleaning glass, stood up with her independently verified record and her chain of provenance and her transcribed ledger and her sworn local testimony and her 3 sealed copies, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not gloat, and she simply, methodically, with the calm of a person who has been certain for a long time and is finally permitted to show her working, took the heroic Trevanion maritime heritage apart plank by plank in front of the people who had funded a monument to it. She showed them the false light ledger. She showed them the manifests of the murdered. She showed them the child's shoe. She showed them, last, the document that connected the modern Cormorant Key's own brochure, its claim of 3 centuries of Trevanion sea rescue, directly to the chamber's record of those same dates marked with the small, careful crosses of the deliberately drowned, so that every soul in that room understood that an £80 million public development had been sold on the precise inversion of the truth, heroism stamped over murder, a statue raised to drowners dressed as savers. The reversal, when it came, was total, and it was the supporting characters' faces that carried it. The Heritage Fund officials going gray as they understood what they had funded, the investors already reaching for their telephones, the local press, who had run 100 soft features on the noble Trevanions, beginning to understand the story they had actually been sitting on top of for a century. And Sir Julian Trevanion himself, who did the thing that proud men do at the exact moment their pride becomes their ruin, which was to stand up and attempt to do to Edie in that room what Crane had done to her 3 years before, to call her unstable, vindictive, a failed academic with a grudge, salting her own find. And it did not work, because this time she had armor, and the armor was the whole patient structure of independent verification she had spent months building precisely so that this attack, which she had known was coming because it always comes, would break against it harmlessly in front of everyone, and turn, and reveal the man making it for exactly what he was. Justice was not a thunderclap. It was the slow grinding of consequence that real justice always is. The Cormorant Key development was suspended, its public funding frozen pending investigation, its investors fled. The destruction of the scheduled site became a criminal prosecution that reached, through the men who had done it, to the man who had ordered it, and a baronet learned that there are still a few crimes that money negotiates with rather than dismisses. The heroic statue was never raised. And the chamber under the shack, recorded, protected, became what Winifred had meant it to become, the most significant site of its kind in the country, the place where the soft lie of the romantic coast was finally, permanently, replaced with the hard names of the drowned who got, at last, 250 years late, the only justice the dead can have, which is to be known to have been murdered. As for Aldous Crane, Eddie had not forgotten him, and the world, it turned out, has a long memory once it is given a reason to look. The forensic standards of documentation she had brought to the Pendrith chamber were so visibly, publicly superior to anything in her field that the old questions about the panel 3 years before came back, this time with the weight of her vindication behind them, and the salted fine that had ended her career was quietly re-examined, and Crane's reputation took, in the end, the precise wound he had given her, and she did not lift a finger to twist it, because she had learned that the deepest revenge is simply to be so undeniably good at the true thing that the lie can no longer stand in the same room as you. Eddie did not get rich. The chamber's contents were national heritage, and she never wanted them to be anything else. She got something she valued more, which the small, failed woman cleaning glass cases had stopped believing she would ever have again. Her name back, her work back, a professorship offered by the Northern University that had helped her, and the slow, quiet respect of people who had learned the hard way that they had judged her completely wrong. She took the chair. She also kept the shack, restored it, the rotten timbers replaced, and worked from it, above the chamber, looking out over the bar where so many had been lured to drown, the keeper now of their evidence as her greytan had been the keeper before her, the difference being that Eddie had finished the work Winifred could not, and made the keeping mean something at last. She thought often of Winifred's words at the end, "You're the one who looks underneath." The world, Eddie had come to understand, is built for the surface lookers, for the ones who accept the brochure, the legend, the confident man in the beautiful suit, the comfortable story stamped over the hard truth. It rewards them mostly. It calls the surface the sea and never asks what the sea is keeping. But every so often the world hands the hard truth to someone who cannot help but look underneath, who was perhaps made to look underneath by being shown, young and cruelly, exactly how the surface lies. And when it does, the surface lookers and the confident men and the whole comfortable machinery of the agreed-upon story should be afraid, because the underneath has been waiting, patient and dry and complete, for the one person who will take it seriously. They had all looked at Edith Marlow and seen nothing worth their attention. She had been the most important person in the story the whole time. And the lesson she left, carved by her own hand into the dry stone of the chamber beneath the painted names of the drowned, was the truest thing she knew. That what is buried is not the same as what is gone, that the surface is never the whole of the sea, and that sooner or later on every coast the water gives up what was done in the dark to whoever was willing to go down and look.